So welcome, Katie, Daisy, thanks so much for joining us today. Do you want to just introduce yourselves to start with?
Okay, absolutely, I'll go first. My name's Katie Conliffe. I am the clinical lead occupational therapist for our child and adolescent mental health services. I'm also the head of occupational therapy at Cygnet Joyce Parker, our CAMHS site in the West Midlands.
And I'm Daisy Seller. I'm the head occupational therapist at our CAMHS site at Bury.
Thank you so much for joining us. I guess the natural place to start is just to explain about our CAMHS services, what kind of services they are and perhaps how they interlink with each other.
Absolutely. So we've got 3 CAMHS services within Cygnet Healthcare. We've got our site in the West Midlands, one in Bury and Cygnet Sheffield as well. And we have different types of wards at each site. So each site has a GAU, general adolescent ward. The average length of stay for a young person on that ward is about 12 weeks. We have psychiatric intensive care units. We'll call them PQ for the purposes of this podcast. And the average length of stay nationally for a PQ is about 8 weeks. And then we have a low secure unit at each site. And average length of stay for a young person could be sort of a year to 18 months. All of our young people are aged between 12 and 18. So we don't take anybody younger than that. And we've got occupational therapists working across all of those wards and in all of those services.
Thank you, that's great. So as the clinical lead for CAMHS, you're working on those sort of sub-service lines, aren't you, in terms of bringing those people together and looking about the pathway through those services. Do you want to talk to us about the models that you've developed and that you're using in the services?
Absolutely. If I start, then we can move to Daisy. So I think when I first started in CAMHS, and certainly when it came into the clinical lead post, for many years people had seen sort of every ward that we had as OT was delivered in exactly the same way. But I think one of the things we've worked really hard on is acknowledging that the length of somebody's stay or the kind of depth and treatment that they need varies by the reasons that they're, for the reasons that they're in hospital. So, for example, in the LSU pathway where I work, we know that young persons usually come in to engage with a substantive amount of therapy, and some of that will be psychological. Usually there's a lot of occupational therapy input. We know they'll be with us for about a year. So we really are able to get stuck into sort of the treatment that they need. So we'll complete an assessment, as we do with everybody when they come in, and then we'll work out where we're going to go from there. And some of that might be around developing age-appropriate life skills, because they might, by the time they come to a low secure unit, it's likely that they will have been in hospital for some time already. So we'll be looking at kind of developing skills that might not have been developed or might have been lost from admission. It could be that we do some emotional regulation work. Usually that's quite closely linked to sensory integration work as well, because we have a lot of sensory integration need in our low secure units. And actually, as we move to transition, I tend to do a lot of work around supporting people back to the community. We've done a little bit of work around helping people to find voluntary work or get into college or find a job. But actually, with the time that we have with young people, we can really sort of drill down to what they want to achieve and have a slow transfer to the community, but make sure all of those provisions are there, which I think is the benefit of an LSU, and it's an aspect that I like in terms of that longer term working. And I know you work on our PQ and oversee some of our acute services, so if you want to talk about the models there.
Yeah, so I guess the difference with the PQs and the GAUs is that the shorter length of stay. So certainly on the PQs, the initial focus is getting that assessment done and seeing if there's any kind of short, really targeted work we can do in the length of time that they're likely to be with us, rather than planning for stuff that might go on beyond their length of stay. And similarly with the GAU, 12 weeks isn't an awfully long time, so you wanting to have you've got that window to do your work in that time. I guess we are doing all our usual assessments. One of the challenges we come up with is a lot of the assessments that we've kind of inherited in our services are assessments that have come from adult services, and we are having to either adapt them or to change how we use them to consider where our young people are at developmentally, and in their treatment stage. So yeah, it's
I think that's a really important point. I mean, in one of the other podcasts, we talk about the adult PQ and acute services, and then it's transferring that into a service for younger people. What are the main differences there that you'd expect to see? What marks that out as a very different service?
I think, and one of the things I talk a lot about in our service line meetings is we have this presumption that the young people who come to us can do the things that we expect at their age. And I would imagine it would be the same for our adult services, but it's a very long time since I've worked in adult services. So I know a lot of our young people, and I think it's something roughly around 86% have speech and language difficulties, but that might not necessarily be evident to me because it might be something around how they receive the information or how they are able to remember it. So we have to adapt our assessments, we have to adapt our interventions. I feel quite passionately about not presuming that if somebody comes to me at the age of 16, for example, that they can shower. So we do a lot of personal care work. I've worked with young people over time where we've got to the age of 16 and nobody's ever taught them how to shower or how to use shower gel or how to wash their hair. So when they come to us at 16, we make an assumption, I think, sometimes as healthcare professionals, that somebody already has skills in place. And then when they're not doing it, we think that's something to do with motivation, when actually it's something to do with skill building. So I always I have like a 3-tier approach of, is it motivation? So if somebody wants to do it, do they have the knowledge to do it? So have they been taught how to do that? And then do they have the skill to do it? And if not, then I can certainly teach the skill and any adaptive strategies that are needed. And I think there is a presumption sometimes, and we have quite a lot of older young people, so probably 16 plus in our services, don't we? Where I think there is just an assumption that they're mini adults, and they're not necessarily. And we've talked a lot about understanding, for example, if we're thinking about life skills, what a 12-year-old can do versus what a 17-year-old could do. So I would not expect a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old to be able to make a full meal independently, but that might be something you would expect a 17-year-old to be able to do. However, you need that nuance and an understanding of child development to be able to plan your interventions effectively.
Mm. And I remember from university, it's not something that they spend a lot of time teaching you about child development. When I was at uni, I think we had one lecture on it, or maybe one day, where we were looking at kind of these stages of child development. So it's something that I'm newer to CAMHS. I've been in CAMHS nearly 2 years now. It's something that's kind of a very quick learning curve.
Yeah, you've got to
Coming
add
into
your
that.
own learning on top
Yeah.
of your existing skills
Yeah.
there, haven't you? And what about you, Katie? For someone who's worked in CAMHS services over a longer period of time and in a few different services, what do you see as the biggest challenge?
So there's always the challenge of understanding the role of occupational therapy, and we've talked about it on previous podcasts about how either community teams that you speak to don't really understand what we do. Sometimes I think actually the young people in our services have a much better exposure to occupational therapy nowadays, so they get what we do quite easily. Sometimes even the battle with our own team about we're not just kitchen assessments and transport assessments. I spent some time recently talking to one of our doctors about one of the assessment tools that we use, and like, they've worked in CAMHS a very long time. I didn't realise you used a model of human occupation screening tool, for example. I was like, well, I know that the services you've worked in do. And we talked through it. I think there's a challenge around people maybe feeling disappointed particularly if they've had repeat hospital admissions. That level of engagement, they might feel quite deflated, particularly when they come to LSU because they think, oh, it's another year in hospital. They might feel deflated. They might not want to engage with us. I do think there's something around as well. For me, I get very frustrated around discharge and transition, and my feeling particularly that somebody might need occupational therapy support post-discharge, but there are very few teams that have occupational therapists that support in the way I do. And we're seeing increasing numbers of young people in CAMHS units aren't being discharged because of the lack of provision or placement post-discharge. And as I can see young people ready to leave our service, and it makes me frustrated. And at times it makes me quite angry as well, because I think my approach has always been the least amount of time spent in hospital, the better for anybody, regardless of your age. Hospital is the short-term intervention. It's not the long-term intervention. I think that's changed over my time as well as a practitioner. It's harder to discharge people now.
Yeah, and I think quite often what we were saying before is that a lot of our service users, our young people, are kind of that 16 to 18-year-olds. And then once they turn 18, you've got that transitioning to adult services. And it feels like a lot of the delayed discharges end up being because someone has hit 18, and it's that whole transferring from one service to another and the delays that are incurred by that, people not knowing where to signpost people to, not knowing who's responsible for what, and even in that kind of 17 and a half to 18-year-old, who's picking up that on discharge, that person on discharge, who's taking responsibility and supporting that person to return to the community.
Or will they get that support? Because it's the under 18 system versus the post 18 system is very, very different. And my experiences, and you're closer to having done the transition between adults and CAMHS, is that actually you get significant support under 18. Post 18, it's a very different landscape.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is hard from having spoken to some of our young people to navigate because of the intensity of under 18 input that you get, that sometimes can just go. And it varies by where you come from as well. And that's really frustrating when you've been on a journey with someone and then you think, but they really need this support and help and they're not going to get it.
So there's definitely a frustration within the system, isn't there? If we take that away and look at sort of the day-to-day, and I know every day is completely different, but thinking about that day-to-day, you know, you come in on a morning and you're raring to go. What's going to be your biggest challenge on a Monday morning in Joyce Parker or in Cygnet Berry? What's the...
Something that Berry's getting better at is having a whole team approach to kind of events planning, because I think you probably covered it in the last series about that expectation that OT does the bingo and the barbecues and that sort of stuff. And actually, we've got a really supportive hospital manager at the moment who is really really encouraging every profession is part of the team and everybody has a part to play in the kind of additional, the bonus stuff that we get to do. And in CAMHS services, we do a lot of fun stuff. But it's kind of that expectation of some of the other members of our teams that it's our job to do that, and getting past that.
Yeah. So it's educating the rest of the team, I guess, isn't it? That actually you've got your role to fulfil.
Yes.
And if you've got a little bit of time at the end, then you'll get involved in some of the nice things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think so for me, it's the variety of things that you get asked to do. I'm like, how is that occupational therapy? So we had not long ago, a young person had ordered something that got delivered to the local post office. And I'm like, can you go and collect it? I was like, well, that's not my job. Why would that be my job? Well, yesterday I got an email saying somebody's bought a bath mat, it needs risk assessing. So I was like, I didn't know they were a slip risk in the shower. And when I went, they'd actually just bought a bath mat to step onto when they got out of the shower to dry the feet. And I was like, that's absolutely fine. That's nothing to do with me. Nobody do a care plan. You know, it doesn't need risk assessing by me, but there's that kind of, we're not quite sure. So maybe occupational therapy will do it.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And kind of weeding that out, still within the team. And I've worked with my team for a long time. Yeah. And even occasionally I'll get, do you know this or do you know that? But I have a really nice thing at the moment as well, where like a lot of our young people will come to me and say, do you mind, they've got clothes that need repairing and things like that. So I'm always like, I've got my little sewing kit. And I don't mind doing those kinds of things. So I feel that's a kind of a nurture thing for some of them. But yeah, I don't need to go and collect a parcel for somebody.
No. And I think that's the challenge we see, you know, if you speak to any occupational therapist, isn't it? There's always that constant theme of misunderstanding of what we do or really making it clear what our goals are and what we're working towards. Is there anything you feel that is different working with young people rather than adults that gives you a different sort of challenge day to day?
I think for me, coming into CAMHS 2 years ago after a long time working with adults, it's getting back into that teenage mindset and being able to relate to the young people. I tried with TikTok and I just don't get it. But it's that kind of the differences in language and interests and just things that you can use to build that therapeutic relationship up with somebody. Being able to talk about Heartstopper on Netflix for some of our young people, it's a really something that they can get really, really into, and you can have really good conversations about, and being open to yourself spending some of your personal time engaging with some of those kind of culturally maybe a bit younger than I'm expecting to.
So developing your own
Yeah,
interests, isn't
absolutely.
it, to try and align with the people that you're spending all that time with and working with.
Yeah.
I feel less. That is a challenge because I love TikTok and I love Heartstopper. Although I was having a conversation with a couple of the young people the other day and they were playing some music, and I'm really into Boy Genius at the moment and Phoebe Bridgers and Lucy Dacus, and they were like, aren't you too old to be into Boy Genius? How do you know about Boy Genius? I was like, go away. Of course I'm not. I think, I think my challenge is probably, and to be fair, I think we're good at this in CAMHS. It's always thinking about least restrictive as well. And how can I help somebody to do something rather than get stuck in the what happens if it goes wrong type of thinking? Because actually the practice in CAMHS is very different to adult services. So we're always looking at how we can make it happen on a much faster pace. Bear in mind, it's a while since I worked in adults. You could be on leave the next day. You might have had an incident, but be out of the hospital the next day. And my experience historically in adults was actually it might take a little bit longer for that process to happen. Or we could be, you could have an incident one day and be on unescorted the next. The thinking is much quicker. And sometimes decisions, whilst we always make a decision in the morning, sometimes that might need to change during the day. So communicating that to everybody involved. And I would always rather try it than not. And I think often you can rely on your therapeutic relationship with somebody to think, I could keep this person safe. Not everybody in the team will feel that as well. Sometimes I've sat in conversations where navigating a difference of opinion is really hard because I think I could take somebody out and I would 100% think that they would be safe, but not everybody in the team feels that. And I've always said, usually something, because occupational therapy is a very doing therapy, people are generally able to keep themselves safe whilst they're doing, because it's focused, it's targeted, it's usually something they want to do.
It should be meaningful and purposeful.
It should be meaningful
Absolutely.
and purposeful, yes, and it usually is.
Yeah.
But not everybody sees it that way, and I think people get worried about what that risk would mean. So sometimes I have to check myself and think, have I got a false confidence here that I could take this person out in the car on my own, or I could take this person into Birmingham city centre, just me on the train, and it'll be fine. But I don't think I have most of the time. Most of the time, because it's meaningful and purposeful, I know that it will go the way we want it to. It will be, a benefit to their recovery, and it'll
So how do you get the rest of the team on board? If you've got that confidence, how do you work with the rest of the team so that they can see the advantage of working in that sort of less risk averse way?
So I explain it. Also, I'm quite I think persuasive personality in our team as well. But I'll say, I know it will be safe because this, and this. And also, our safety record generally speaks for itself. People are much more likely to get stuck in their own thoughts when they've got nothing to do, or things that don't interest them, or that they're being forced to do.
Yeah, and I think as kind of as me and Katie are kind of seniors in our teams, it's that can be really hard for some of our band fives who are quite new to newly qualified, new to CAMHS, new to these sorts of services, and actually part of our job as well is empowering our band fives and our junior colleagues to be able to explain the things that we're explaining and feel confident doing that and assertive in the teams that they're working with, because they're coming up against the same barriers as us, but they haven't necessarily got the experience that we've got, but we can share that and we can empower them with our knowledge and our experiences.
And I think that's something just to explore a bit more, thinking about. So Katie, as the lead and pulling all of those people together to think about how we empower those newly qualified or new into CAMHS occupational therapists. Do you want to talk about some of the things that you're doing to ensure that consistency and that empowerment within the services?
Do. So, because we do quite a lot together in terms of bringing everybody together. So we've recently done some training because we've recruited quite a lot of new Band 5s into the service. We did the occupational therapy group model training, and that went really well. I think everybody really appreciated just being in the same room together. Daisy and I cross-supervised some of the other OTs at one of the other sites. If one of your OTs has got something perhaps sensory related that they're not sure about, I will pick up a phone and support that OT. I think now we've got a nice sharing culture. Now everybody's met in person. We do have our service line meetings as well. We have team meetings on site too, to help our Band 5s. I think role modelling is quite an important part as well.
Yeah, definitely.
And as I've said in previous podcasts, I think like the OT is the linchpin of the team. And I have to say, I think in Cygnet, like compared to other services I've worked in, occupational therapy is given a lot of respect. Their opinion carries a lot of weight. But I think it's very daunting when I speak to some of our newly qualified OTs who will say, well, there's a doctor in the room and I can't say something different to what the doctor has said. And I said, well, absolutely, of course you can, because you're the expert in what you're doing. Leave is a really good example that I get really passionate about, because we're the people that take the young people out, so we see how they are in the community, what they do in the community, but actually the decision as to whether they can have more leave or not doesn't sit with us.
No. The doctors and the nurses.
And it's doctors and the nurses. And I'm like, you don't take them out, but I can tell you that they're absolutely perfectly
It's about
safe.
how you inform that decision-making
and it's how
process,
you communicate
isn't it?
Yeah. And using some of our more structured like the MOHOST, for example, is a great way to communicate that. If you can say, they're able to do this, they're able to be safe when crossing the road. But equally, if you're concerned, and I recently supported one of our Band 5s who did a community assessment, came back, felt the patient wasn't safe, was very distracted in the community, wasn't safe crossing the road. But then the agreement was made that they could continue to have leave. And the Band 5 was saying, like, I'm actually really concerned that if you didn't have very observant staff about what this might mean for that young person, making that argument about why they might need specific tailored input from a member of the MDT to go instead, or to hold off a little bit equally. So it's not just the positive.
So it's just ensuring that support's matched as well, isn't it?
But communicating that, I don't know if there's anything you'd add.
I think we're fortunate in our services that we have kind of OT assistants as well as qualified OTs, and actually having that role as well. We've got some very experienced OTAs, we've got some very new OTAs, and there's processes by which we can empower our more experienced staff, even if they are OTAs and Band 5s, to buddy up and to support and teach the new starters, the newer staff, and that can really increase their confidence and their kind of satisfaction in their job, their feeling of actually, I know how to do this job, and that can be really empowering for them as well.
And I think it's nice that that pathway, isn't there, for people? Katie, you've got an activity coordinator who's doing the apprenticeship with the goal of becoming an occupational therapist. And I think, if we've got people that have seen those services from different perspectives, it's a really nice way into the profession for them, isn't it?
Yeah. We have quite a lot of OT assistants who want to go on and train to be occupational therapists. You've had quite a few from Bury, haven't you? I've got 2 at the moment who want to go and do that, but they'd not had the exposure to occupational therapy before they came to work with us. So I very recently got my occupational therapy assistants, but 2 of them that came to us had seen us working in the hospital, witnessed it and said, I want to do that, which is great. That they've picked that up and thought, this is my third one wanted to do psychology, and now I was saying, well, actually you use a lot of psychology in your day-to-day work, maybe occupational therapy is for me. And I was like, absolutely, it's a beautiful blend of psychology and doing, so why not?
Brilliant. So I think we've talked about some of the challenges, haven't we? If we look at the other side of that, again, thinking specifically to working with these young people rather than in adult mental health services, what are the rewards? What is it that you go home at the end of the day and think, yes?
Certainly, as someone who's spent a long time working in adult services, coming into CAMHS and seeing sometimes a much quicker rate of change and much quicker to getting someone to discharge, and sometimes feeling like actually what we've done now might prevent them needing services as an adult. That's massively
That's
rewarding.
huge.
Yeah.
I think every discharge is a win. And I always say to everybody who comes in, like, you're going to be going, we will get you out. You are going to be discharged. In my ideal world, always before they are old enough to move to adult services. And I generally think we tend to do that quite well. There's joys along the way of sometimes you help somebody to do something that they either never thought they'd do or they've never had the opportunity to do. So over my time, I remember I took a young person to the cinema who was 17, who'd never been to the cinema, and was just like really overwhelmed by it. But that their social circumstances had never meant that they could go to the cinema. And that, for me, I think was quite memorable because I was like, well, I assume everybody had been to the cinema, you know. Supporting, so sometimes we get little snippets come back of how well people are doing post-discharge, and every time I hear how well they're doing, I'm like, yes, you know, because I'd never want young people to come back into services. I always say that to them as they're going out the door. You know, I hope in the nicest possible way, we never want to see you again. But every time I hear, somebody's moved on or moved down a level of security in terms of where they are on their pathway to discharge, I just think, well, that's why you come in every day. You know, I get a smile on my face. I had an email from a young person the other day who wanted access to something that they'd done whilst they were with us. And they were like, just thought I'd let you know, I'm at home now. And honestly, I was got tears in my eyes at my desk. That's how I feel every time.
And similarly, sometimes the feedback you get from parents is something that I didn't feel like we got as much on adult services, obviously. Working with adults, there wasn't necessarily that need to
that
have
external feedback
contact
as well.
with parents and stuff, but actually that can be really kind of heartwarming to get a my OTA got one of our patients to wash his hair last week, and I just let the mum know, and she was like, oh, that's made my day. And it's just those little things that just
we're supporting a whole family at the end of the day, aren't we? We're not just supporting a young person. Sometimes we're working with parents to understand how they can help somebody when they return home. Sometimes actually coming into hospital is the support that the young person and family couldn't get in the community. I worked with a young man just recently who had autism, and it was so clear when he came to us that his sensory needs were so great, and actually wasn't on my ward. I was just supporting one of the other wards because his sensory needs were so great. And I'd sent lots of links to mum. I'd had a conversation with the community team. I'd met with parents because, you know, he really struggled with personal care. And then on the day that he left, I went into the reception and mum and dad came up, and they're very lovely people. And they just said, can we give you a hug? And I was like, well, absolutely, because I'm a hug. And mum's crying, and she's like, I don't think if it wasn't for occupational therapy, nobody would understand what his needs are, ready for when him to come home. He's like, I think occupational therapy have been the thing that have changed his pathway. In mental health services. And this is a young man that had been in a while, but actually a lot of his difficulties were around sensory integration. Separating, you know, what people thought his mental health difficulties were, a lot of it was just overwhelm constantly. And that was the bit I could help with, even down to recommending a trampoline to use at home and things like that. And mum's like, we've never had this level of input. And she was just crying on my shoulder, and it was really lovely. Those are really lovely moments, aren't they?
Yeah.
So all this wealth of experience, and I mean, it's great hearing these anecdotes as well, but you've spent some time writing a book as a service line, haven't you? And some of these things have gone into there. Do you want to give us, I know there's a case study in there as well, do you want to give us a bit of a, you know, not blow by blow, but an overview of the case study? I think it helps people maybe understand what's in there.
So thinking about a low secure pathway case study, I worked with a young person who'd been in hospital for 2 years prior to coming to the low secure unit across a couple of our different sites, and they'd been in as the psychiatric intensive care environment for I think a year before they came to the low secure unit. So sometimes we do have people who stay longer than the average length of stay because they just can't find a move on pathway, and one of our GAU wards as well. So when they came to us, it was really difficult. They'd not really engaged with therapy or occupational therapy at all during their time in inpatient. And so when they came to us, a lot of my work was focused around building a therapeutic relationship, finding out what they liked to do, finding out what they wanted to do. They really didn't want to engage with me to begin with. Some days it would just be going and knocking on the door in the morning and saying, are you going to come to a group? Are you going to come to an activity? What can I help you with? Very often they would tell me to go away. But continuing, I think, to come back as well. Because that's really important, to just show up and be there and be present. And that's really important, I think, in terms of somebody feeling that the adults in their life are going to, stick with them regardless, because some of our young people, the adults haven't stuck with them. And that's really hard.
So there's an element of that positive role modelling, isn't there, as well?
Yes, yeah. And generally, and I think our young people are really pleasant and respectful, but there are times where you do have to face quite a lot of somebody really trying to push you away rather than engage with you. And you always have to be a bit Teflon as an occupational therapist. So one of the things I think on your band 5 struggle with is when people tell them to go away, they're like, okay, then I'll go away. Whereas I'm like, I'll be back tomorrow, or, use a lot of humour or something like that, because nobody's going to benefit if I just go away and never come back to you. So we built the therapeutic relationship, and I discovered that they had been a young carer. So we talked a lot about skills that they'd had. Their independent skills were really great, but you can't do that on a low secure to begin with if your risk is high, if your risk of self-harm is high. So they like to wash their own clothes, they like to cook their own meals. Those were kinds of things that we focused on because that gave them that was meaningful and purposeful to them. They liked to do it themselves. They were actually brilliant at budgeting. So we gave them access to our ADL kitchen, which is on the ward, so they could cook for themselves every day. Tried to reduce it so that they only had to have one other person in. So by the time they left, actually, I would often go in, they'd have the keys for the kitchen cupboards, and I'd be sat with my laptop because they needed to be escorted, but they were entirely independent and entirely safe in the kitchen. So they were doing that every day. We focused on going out into the community because they were really anxious about talking to people. They'd never used public transport, so had a fear of public transport. They'd never really, in a shop, we taught them how to use self-service tills because they would never approach somebody. They were very anxious about talking to a customer assistant or even buying clothes, those types of things. So we worked on those skills. And then we moved from escorted leave to unescorted leave. And I did a huge chunk of work around anxiety reduction on unescorted leave and put a graded programme in place over a series of weeks to help them to build their confidence. And that looked like me and them going out together to begin with, but then it would be that I would take them to a local retail park in the unit vehicle, and I would sit in the Costa Coffee whilst they went off to the shops, and I would give them a call halfway through to check they were okay, and they would come back to me. Then that looked a bit like I would just drop them off and then go and collect them, and then we learned how to use a taxi to get there, and that eventually, as we got to the point of discharge, they were sort of out for 3 or 4 hours a day doing that, going shopping for their own food or coming back. Things that were starting to look like what they'd be doing in the community because they were moving into a supported living package. We then did a huge chunk with the provider that they were moving to around training the staff to support the young person, because I think that's another thing that we do a lot on LSU. We train staff to think about the ways we've worked with somebody and how they could support that in their environment. And by this point, I'd worked with this young person for, I think it was 14 months. So I knew them incredibly well. And I was able to say, actually, they like to do this when they go in a shop. So it's really helpful. If you want to build a therapeutic relationship with this young person, this is what you need to focus on. And then I started helping to sort of take them to their new placement, and we did a little bit of shopping for things for the house and those types of things, just as a bridge person. And then they transitioned to their new placement. And then I very rarely saw them on the weeks that they were at their new placement, and then they were discharged. And that was a period of work that I think from the moment they came to us took about 40 months to get them to that point where they were really independent by the time they left us, which is what they wanted, but also were really anxious about as well. And I think actually the bulk of intervention for that young person was occupational therapy intervention. The sheer number of hours we spent just doing those basic tasks, talking, communicating, thinking about how we could reduce somebody's anxiety. And some of that was things like role play. So what would you say if you needed to get a taxi? How would you order it? How would you use the mobile phone? What happens if the taxi didn't turn up when you were expecting it to? Those kinds of things that we take for granted as an adult.
It's a really nice, safe way of testing that out, isn't it?
Yeah. And so they successfully transitioned to the community, which again, had a little bit of feedback from them that they're doing really well. And that gives me so much joy to know people are doing so well post-discharge.
I think that gives people a really nice insight into, we always say, don't we, no 2 days are the same, no 2 people are the same, but it gives people a little taste of what life might be like in those services. I think when we think about occupational therapy as a discipline, one of the most important things is that role identity, isn't it? And I guess when we think about CAMHS services, we're thinking about working with a population where that role identity is still developing, whereas in adult services that might have developed further. What's the impact of that in terms of the things that you need to consider?
I think for a lot of our young people, they've, like we said, they're still in their development. So they've maybe one of the main roles they've known is being a child, and actually they're developing towards becoming a young adult. And they might understand the role of being a pupil at school, but how that might change to going to college or going further in their education, or becoming a worker, doing a more vocational role, and even other roles, kind of caring for family, things like that, the things that they might not have had as much experience with, or some of them have had super amounts of experience with when they have been young carers. It gives us a lot to think about as therapists, doesn't it? In terms of how we support that, and it's getting back to our roots and making sure we get to know our patients well from the outset through our assessments.
I think identity is one of the biggest things that we work on with our young people. So I was talking to one of our experts by experience earlier about, so it's really hard, and I think this about anybody who's been in hospital for a period of time. Over time, some people develop a mental health patient identity, and that's hard not to do, because your links with the community or your friends or your family, particularly if you're placed out of area, can sort of really be strained. Sometimes you lose contact with people. So what you have is a social group who are your age, and you have a peer group who you might form friends with in hospital. They might not necessarily be people you would choose to be friends with outside of hospital, but that's who's there. And you can, I think, and I would argue that this is true in adults as well, but actually your identity becomes very much around you as a patient, particularly in the landscape. Because if you look at sort of a lot of the stuff that goes on social media nationally in CAMHS, there's a lot around identifying as somebody in a Tier 4 service or an inpatient service. And for me, I really fight against that identity. So I was talking to our expert by experience about when I think about encouraging people to be experts by experience, I always think about what else do they have in terms of their identity, because actually, if you identify purely in that mental health patient role, or you don't have other things, other interests, or other relationships, or other things that you want to achieve, what's the benefit then of spending all of your time focusing on moving into an expert by experience role when you don't have other things that bring joy to your life? I think that's one thing that can really work for somebody, but what else who else do you identify as? And if, like, adolescence is a time of finding your identity, isn't it? So, there's a lot of gender exploration, there's a lot of sexuality exploration, there's a lot of just who am I? What do I enjoy doing? I remember being a teenager, and I was in about the space of 3 years. I was 3 different people, different clothing, all those kinds of things. So I think a large part of what we do is, let's explore that. If you want to dress this particular way, let's explore it. If you want to experience this particular activity, let's explore that, because you're forever changing during your teenage years. And actually, coming into hospital and then somebody saying you're a mental health patient, or identifying as a mental health patient, stops that exploration a lot, I think. So risk is one of the things that I think stops exploration of identity, because it can stop you from going out and just doing the things that you would normally do as a teenager. So that's when I think about the normative development. What would you be doing as a teenager at this point? Smoking's a really good example. So lots of teenagers try smoking, lots of teenagers smoke. We're no smoking services. We're constantly having a discussion in our services about the use of vapes and smoking, and whether somebody smokes on leave or doesn't smoke on leave. Lots of teenagers smoke. And then choose not to smoke in the future. But, is that a risk behaviour? And we'll go round and round and have is that a risk behaviour?
Lots of different ways to look at that.
Lots of teenagers smoke. So if you're a smoker, you'd be super frustrated if we're sat there going, actually, you can't smoke, And there's very similar things, I think. I always remember a discussion about, when I first qualified, I always remember having a discussion about somebody who'd been on leave and had sex with a partner. So it was somebody they'd gone to school with, and I really remember people saying that's really risky behaviour. And I was like, actually, lots of teenagers have sex, so that's not. I think in the context of a 17, almost 18-year-old having sex, that's not risky behaviour. Lots of teenagers at that age are having sex, but it's how you view it, and I think that's a challenge sometimes in the work that we do.
And I guess that's very hard. Sometimes people will bring their own personal opinions and morals and experiences, which might not necessarily match up with the rest of the team, the young person in question, their family. There's so many things to consider in those situations, isn't there? But I think overall, we're in such a privileged position to be able to work with somebody while they're exploring all of that identity and themselves moving forward, aren't we, to be involved in that journey.
I had a young person that I supported, I think, I was trying to work it out the other day, 6.5 years ago, particularly around sort of their exploration of gender and their identity. And they messaged me 3 weeks ago just to let me know how they, email me, just to let me know how they were doing. 6.5 years later, they're letting me know how they're doing. And I had a moment where I was like, oh my gosh, they remember me 6.5 years later. I certainly remember them. They're one of the young people that I work with extensively, and they hold a part of my mind around it. Changed how I work with young people exploring their gender. But I don't think you can ever know how much of a contribution you make to somebody's pathway through services. And I don't know about you, Daisy, but I tend to think, oh well, they'll never remember OT, but actually a lot of people do remember OT.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you'd like people to know? If someone was thinking about coming to work in CAMHS, or an OT student who was, dead set that might be the way forward for them, what message would you like to give them?
I'd say do it.
Yeah.
Do it. We need more OTs. We need more people who want to come in and change the landscape of what CAMHS looks like and what occupational therapy in CAMHS looks like. I mean, we do a lot of CPD, but I think even I had to acknowledge the other day, oh gosh, so much is changing so rapidly. We need new blood in CAMHS, because those of us that do it will have done it for a while. It's so rewarding. I'm not going to lie, it's incredibly challenging at times, and you have to have, I think, good emotional resilience.
Yeah, I was going to say it can be really hard, and really, there's a lot of what's the word where we're taking on the trauma sometimes? Transference.
Yeah.
And making sure that you've got coping mechanisms for managing that side of the job. But as Katie says, incredibly rewarding.
there's a lot of, I think we talk often, and there's the growing awareness in mental health services about secondary trauma for staff who work in services. And that's not just around the challenging behaviour that you deal with. Sometimes that's about hearing what people have experienced, and you think, oh, they're a child and they've experienced so much, and then I'm carrying that. And you can't not, and I wouldn't not. I think that's the other thing to think about. I wouldn't want it any other way. But there is a lot more that we have to do nowadays to take care of our own well-being and ensure that we are resilient, because there are days that are very challenging on the ward where the alarms go off constantly all day, physically exhausting. I've had days where I'm just, so tired when I get home. I would always go back the next day, but it's about having that awareness. I think if you don't, that is where you would burn out.
Potentially there's a whole other episode there, isn't there, about emotional resilience and well-being and how we protect ourselves
and
in
it's
those
now part
situations.
of the HCPC standards, isn't it? It's that you were part
to
that being
look after your own well-being, which I think is a great change to the HCPC standards, because it wasn't there before. And I think generally I always say to my team, if it's been a tough day, call me. And they will call me at 8, they will call me at 9. I don't mind. That's what I'm there for my team. But don't take it home, don't carry it on your own, share it, because we're all there to share it with. If you can't share it with me because I'm off, call Daisy or call someone else, but don't hold it, because holding it is the surefire way to burn out and to become overwhelmed yourself. I think after, I think this year is my 11th year working in CAMHS, because I knew as soon as I had my CAMHS placement I wanted to work in CAMHS. I was like, this is absolutely it. And I think resilience is the thing that when I think about our newly qualified, that's the thing I look to build.
Well, thank you so much for coming in, both of you. It's been absolutely fascinating, and hopefully people listening and watching have been able to take something away from that will help them in future with their own practice, or food for thought for people maybe in other services as well.
Thank you for inviting us back.
Thank you.